Tonight, we uncover a secret hidden in plain sight, a knowledge so carefully guarded that the Vatican did not merely record it. They sealed it behind centuries of silence, whispers, and lost manuscripts. The names of demons you think you know, the ones etched into the rituals, the warnings, and the prayers of Christendom have origins older and stranger than anyone has been allowed to admit. These names were not created by imagination alone. They were drawn from forbidden texts, ancient visions, and celestial hierarchies that predate the Church itself. And the true story of how these names entered Christian thought has been locked away in archives, libraries, and the shadowed corners of history. Those who tried to trace them faced censored manuscripts, restricted vaults, and the relentless authority of an institution determined to control both belief and memory. Tonight, we will journey into that hidden world, following the trail of names, manuscripts, and power, to reveal how the secret origins of Christian demonology were preserved, transformed, and concealed. Before we dive in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, because what you are about to learn challenges everything you thought you knew about the forces both above and below. There is a name whispered in ancient texts that most people have never heard: the Watchers. Not angels, not demons, but something in between. Sent to watch over humanity, they became symbols of a rebellion so dangerous. Their story was buried for centuries. But why? Why does this forgotten group of beings show up again and again in ancient scrolls, mystical writings, and forbidden lore, only to vanish from modern teachings? The answer may lie not in what they did, but in what they revealed. Because if the Watchers were real, then parts of religious history were never meant to be closed books. They were edited, silenced, locked away. Long before Christianity took hold in Europe, the world was full of stories about celestial beings who walked among men. These were not simply myths. They were part of a wider tradition that included Jewish, Mesopotamian, and early Christian beliefs. The Book of Enoch, written thousands of years ago and once considered sacred by many, speaks directly of the Watchers. Described as heavenly beings sent to guide and observe, they instead broke the rules. They shared forbidden knowledge. They taught humans about the stars, weapons, and the secrets of heaven. And in doing so, they triggered a cosmic punishment. The result, according to these texts, was the birth of giants, the fall of empires, and a deep fear that this knowledge might return one day. What's strange is that the Book of Enoch was once well known. Early Christians read it. Some early church fathers quoted it. But later, it was cast out, removed from the Bible, erased from official teachings. Only one Christian tradition, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, kept it as part of their canon. Everyone else let it slip into obscurity, or did they? Because even after it disappeared from Western religion, echoes of the Watchers stayed. In medieval demonology, in tales of fallen angels, even in Renaissance paintings of strange giant beings and heavenly wars. It's not just about ancient myths, it's about control. The story of the Watchers suggests that knowledge itself can be dangerous, especially when it threatens those in power. And perhaps this is why their story feels like a threat. Because it teaches that enlightenment didn't always come from above. Sometimes it came from rebels, from beings who dared to give humanity a glimpse of the divine without asking permission. And if that's true, then the question becomes, who decided it was too dangerous for us to know? The Vatican, as the center of Western Christianity for over 1,000 years, has shaped what stories we tell, what books we read, and what histories we remember. And for most of that time, the Watchers have been missing. Not denied, just not mentioned. Their silence is not proof they never existed. It's a sign that someone didn't want them to matter. But once a name is spoken again, even softly, the silence begins to crack. And maybe that's why the Watchers are still whispering. Not to bring chaos, but to remind us that part of our history is still waiting to be heard. Before the Great Flood, before Moses, before the rise of temples and empires, there was Enoch. Not just a mysterious name in Genesis, but a figure at the center of one of the most powerful and ignored texts in ancient religious history, the Book of Enoch. Written in stages between the 3rd century before Christ and the 1st century of our era, this ancient text claims that Enoch was taken by God and shown secrets no other human had ever seen: the heavens, the punishment of angels, the final judgment, and the structure of time itself. He was not just a prophet. He was a witness to things that would unsettle every religious institution that came after. The Book of Enoch describes a world just before the flood, filled with corruption and chaos. But it also explains why that corruption happened in the first place. According to the text, a group of heavenly beings descended to earth. These were the Watchers. They were supposed to guide and observe humanity, but instead they broke divine law. They taught humans forbidden knowledge, like how to make weapons, how to perform sorcery, how to use herbs for power. They took human wives and had children with them. These children were giants, unnatural in size and spirit, and they brought violence and destruction across the earth. This is the moment when Enoch enters the story. Unlike other humans, Enoch is chosen to speak with the Watchers. He is brought into the heavenly realms and shown visions of what will come. He sees the throne of God. He sees the punishment prepared for the Watchers. He is told that the earth will be cleansed by a great flood, a divine reset to correct the damage they caused. But beyond that, Enoch is also shown a long timeline of cosmic history. He describes a structured heaven, full of angelic orders, celestial bodies, and calendars that track sacred time. His vision includes the rise and fall of future generations, the return of justice, and the judgment of all beings, not just humans, but angels too. This is not just myth. This is a view of the universe that challenges the idea that divine order is simple or one-sided. The Book of Enoch gives humanity a role, not just as followers, but as participants in a cosmic drama. It presents heaven as a place with rules, hierarchies, and consequences. And Enoch becomes a symbol of someone who dares to look beyond the veil and speak what he saw. What makes this even more important is that the Book of Enoch was once widely read. Fragments were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, proving its circulation among early Jewish groups. Early Christian writers like Tertullian and the author of the Epistle of Jude reference it directly. But later, as church authority tightened its control over Scripture, Enoch was removed from the conversation. What remained was only a shadow, a name, a line in Genesis saying Enoch walked with God and was no more. The rest was buried, but now it is returning, and it starts with the vision before the flood. The idea of the Watchers did not begin in the Middle Ages, and it did not come from modern theories. It comes from a very real period in Jewish history, known as Second Temple Judaism. This era stretches from the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple in the 6th century before Christ to its destruction by the Romans in the 1st century. During this time, Jewish thought was full of apocalyptic expectation. People were not only waiting for a Messiah, they were trying to make sense of evil, empire, and injustice in a world that felt broken. And one of the ideas that rose from this crisis was the story of the Watchers. The term Watchers appears in Aramaic as Irin, and in Hebrew texts as a class of heavenly beings. In the Book of Enoch and related writings, the Watchers are angels sent by God to oversee humanity, but instead of staying obedient, they cross a line. They become corrupted. They fall. Their decision to share divine knowledge and take human wives becomes the reason for the flood and the destruction of their own order. This narrative is not some fringe story. It was part of a serious attempt to explain where evil comes from, not just among humans, but in the heavens. In Jewish apocalyptic literature, which includes not just Enoch, but also the Book of Jubilees, the Book of the Giants, and even some texts found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Watchers are treated as a cosmic warning. Their fall is not just about lust or rebellion. It is about the consequences of misusing power and knowledge. They become a mirror for corrupt leaders, for unjust rulers, and for anyone who trades responsibility for control. This is why the story of the Watchers mattered so much in the Second Temple period. It was a coded way of talking about empire, corruption, and the hope for divine justice. What makes this even more powerful is that many of these writings were considered sacred, or at least respected, by some Jewish groups. The community at Qumran, who preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls, copied parts of the Book of Enoch and other Watcher texts. They saw in them a deeper truth about how history works, how judgment comes, and how the heavens are not silent. This was not fan fiction. This was theology. Later, these stories became uncomfortable. As Rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity formed more stable doctrines, the idea of angels falling for humans and producing giants became harder to include. But during the Second Temple period, the Watchers were not conspiracy. They were part of a serious tradition that tried to explain the cracks in the world. And even though many of these texts were eventually left out of the Bible, their ideas echoed for centuries. The Watchers, once part of mainstream apocalyptic thought, were slowly pushed into the shadows. But their origin is clear. They were born not from rumor, but from real ancient questions about justice, heaven, and what happens when divine beings break the rules. The Book of Enoch is not just a mysterious text. It is filled with prophecies. But these are not vague predictions or random visions. They follow a clear theme that runs throughout the book. The prophecies in Enoch are about rebellion, punishment, and the collapse of corrupt powers, and they are not hidden in secret vaults. They are written in plain words, preserved in manuscripts, and studied by scholars today. These prophecies were not meant to entertain. They were meant to warn. They reflect a time in history when people believed the world had fallen under the control of both corrupt rulers and rebellious spiritual forces. One of the most important sections of Enochic literature is known as the Book of the Watchers. This section describes how heavenly beings defied divine law, shared forbidden knowledge with humans, and created a violent race of giants. The prophecy here is that these acts would not go unpunished. The Watchers are judged, bound in darkness, and sentenced to await a final judgment. Their children, the giants, are destroyed in a great flood. But this is just the beginning. Enoch then receives more visions. In another section called the Book of Parables, he sees the rise of a future figure called the Son of Man. This mysterious figure brings justice, defeats kings and mighty ones who abused their power, and restores balance between heaven and earth. The prophecy is clear. Human and spiritual rebellion leads to destruction. But there is also a promise. A divine figure will come to set things right. There is also a prophecy about time itself. In the astronomical book, Enoch is shown how the stars and the calendar work. But more than that, he is told that corrupt rulers will change the times, twist the calendar, and lose their place in the divine order. This is not just about dates. It is a warning that when leaders mess with sacred systems, chaos follows. In the Book of Dreams, Enoch receives a symbolic vision of history from the beginning to the end. It describes Israel, its exile, its return, and the judgment of nations. And it does this using animal symbols that scholars still debate. But the pattern is always the same. Rebellion leads to punishment. Justice is delayed, but never cancelled. The wicked rise, but the righteous are not forgotten. These prophecies were not hidden. They were part of public literature among apocalyptic Jewish groups during the Second Temple period. Fragments were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were known to early Christian writers, but later they were removed from official use, not because they were false, but because they were dangerous. They spoke too openly about corrupt rulers, heavenly rebellion, and a divine judgment that spares no one. These are the prophecies of Enoch, not buried in shadows, but sitting in plain view for those willing to read them. They are not predictions of flying machines or modern wars. They are messages about power, justice, and the cost of ignoring the sacred order of things. The giants of the Book of Enoch are not just monsters from ancient myth. They represent one of the most uncomfortable problems in early religious history. According to Enochic texts, the giants were born from the union of the Watchers and human women. These beings were called the Nephilim, a term that also appears briefly in the book of Genesis. But while Genesis gives only a few words about them, Enoch expands their story into a full crisis. The giants are violent, uncontrollable, and destructive. They devour the resources of the earth, turn against humans, and bring the world into chaos. Their existence becomes the main reason for the flood, a divine judgment to erase what should never have existed. But the real problem is not just that the giants were terrifying. It is that they were the result of a forbidden crossing between heaven and earth. For ancient writers, this was more than a scary story. It was a theological dilemma. If angels could fall, and if their offspring could bring destruction, then the boundary between divine and human was not as firm as religious authorities wanted it to be. That made the giants more than myth. They were a threat to the clean separation between heaven and earth. In the Book of Enoch, the giants cry out as they face death, and their spirits are cursed to wander the earth forever. Some traditions even suggest that these spirits become demons, haunting humanity long after their physical forms are gone. This idea shows up again in later Jewish writings, in early Christian thought, and even in medieval demonology. But not everyone agreed on what to do with this story. As Jewish and Christian theology became more organized, the idea of giants born from angels and women became harder to accept. Some later interpreters tried to change the meaning. They claimed the sons of God in Genesis were just human rulers or noble men, not angels. Others tried to make the giants symbolic rather than literal. Theological pressure to remove the supernatural element grew stronger, especially in the West. By the time Christian doctrine was formalized in the early centuries of the Church, the story of the Watchers and Giants was mostly gone from mainstream teachings. Still, it refused to die. The Ethiopian Church kept the full Book of Enoch in its Bible. Some early Christians, like Justin Martyr and Tertullian, still believed in the Watchers and their giant children. And echoes of the story survived in art, folklore, and underground writings. The presence of giants in ancient texts became a dividing line between accepted theology and forbidden speculation. And that is why this mythic problem matters. It is not just about size or violence. It is about what happens when the boundaries between the sacred and the human collapse. The giants were a symbol of that collapse, and every tradition that came after had to decide whether to include them, explain them away, or hide them altogether. The early Christian world did not speak with one voice when it came to the Book of Enoch. Some saw it as a powerful piece of divine truth. Others saw it as too strange, too dangerous, or simply not part of what they believed should be passed down. This created one of the earliest and longest-running debates in the formation of Christian scripture. The question was simple, but hard to answer. Should Enoch be part of the Bible? The early church did not have a fixed list of books. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, different communities used different texts. Some included writings, like the Shepherd of Hermas, the Epistle of Barnabas, or yes, the Book of Enoch. Others did not. It was not until centuries later that the canon began to solidify. And by then, Enoch had already become a problem. The Epistle of Jude, which is in the New Testament, quotes directly from the Book of Enoch. It calls Enoch the 7th from Adam, and uses a prophecy about divine judgment that is only found in the Enochic tradition. This shows that at least some early Christians accepted the text as meaningful. Church fathers, like Tertullian in the 2nd century, also defended Enoch. He argued that just because the Jews rejected it did not mean Christians should. He believed that the Book of Enoch explained the origin of demons and gave context to the strange verse in Genesis about the sons of God and the daughters of men. For thinkers like him, Enoch helped solve theological puzzles. But not everyone agreed. As the Christian world tried to distance itself from ideas that seemed too magical, too mythological, or too connected to fallen angels, Enoch became more controversial. By the 4th century, figures like Augustine were pushing for a more defined and controlled set of scriptures. Enoch was left out, not because it had been disproven, but because it did not fit the developing image of what Christianity was becoming. It was too apocalyptic, too mystical, too hard to control. The Western Church slowly erased it from use, while the Eastern Church paid it little attention. Only the Ethiopian Church preserved it fully, including it in their canon, where it remains to this day. This was not just about one book. It was about how truth gets defined, who decides which texts are sacred and which are not. The Enoch dilemma shows that early Christianity was not a finished system, but a living debate. Some communities saw Enoch as a key to understanding the battle between good and evil. Others saw it as a threat to unity and order. And over time, that debate faded from public memory. But the questions it raised never went away. What knowledge is too dangerous? What stories are too revealing? And who has the authority to silence a voice that once claimed to speak with the words of heaven? These are the shadows behind the Enoch dilemma, not just about a book, but about the struggle over what gets remembered and what gets erased. Most people imagine the Bible being formed in a single dramatic meeting, with bishops gathering in secret to vote on which books were in and which were out. But the truth is slower and more complex. Canon formation did not happen all at once. It took centuries. And it was never just about belief. It was also about control. The word canon means rule, or measuring stick. In religious terms, it defines which texts are officially sacred. But in history, canon became a boundary, a way to draw a line between accepted truth and everything else. That line was shaped by debates, power struggles, and the slow rise of religious institutions trying to define themselves. In the early centuries after the time of Christ, there was no single Christian Bible. Different communities used different books. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were widely read, but so were others like the Gospel of Thomas, the Apocalypse of Peter, and yes, the Book of Enoch. Some groups considered these texts essential. Others saw them as dangerous or confusing. There were no official lists in the first century. No ruling council that finalized the Bible with a stamp. Instead, the process played out through letters, teachings, local decisions, and eventually, empire. By the 2nd century, church leaders began to push for consistency. Figures like Irenaeus argued for 4 Gospels only. Others, like Marcion, wanted to remove anything that looked too Jewish. These early fights over Scripture showed how much was still open. By the 4th century, powerful bishops and councils began to settle the debate. The Council of Laodicea around the year 360 issued one of the earliest partial lists. Later, the councils of Hippo and Carthage in the late 4th century added more. But these were not global decisions. They reflected regional choices. It was not until the Council of Trent in the 16th century that the Roman Catholic Church officially closed the canon. That is over 1,000 years after the time of Christ. Throughout this long timeline, many books were lost, ignored, or rejected. Some because of theology, some because of politics, others simply because they were too difficult to control. The Book of Enoch was one of these. It remained popular in some circles, but was slowly excluded from the core collection. The canon became a way to create borders. Borders between doctrine and myth, between church authority and local belief, between what was allowed to be read aloud and what had to be hidden away. Understanding canon as a border helps explain why certain texts disappeared. It was not always about truth. It was about unity, safety, and power. Communities chose the texts that helped them survive, define themselves, and control their message. Everything outside that circle became apocrypha, forgotten, forbidden, or labeled as dangerous. But just because something was pushed out does not mean it had no value. It means it crossed a line drawn not in a single day, but over centuries. A canon is not just a collection, it is a wall, and the books left outside are still waiting. When we talk about lost texts and missing prophecies, we often imagine secret rooms or deliberate censorship. But sometimes, what disappears is simply a victim of language. In the ancient world, sacred texts had to move through the fragile system of translation and manual copying, and that process was far from perfect. As Christianity expanded from the Middle East into the Greek-speaking world, and then into Latin-speaking Europe, entire books were left behind, not because they were hated, but because they were unreadable, untranslatable, or forgotten in the shuffle of empire and language shift. In the earliest days of Christianity, Greek was the main language of Scripture. The New Testament was written in Greek. Many Jewish writings, including the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, were already in circulation. The Book of Enoch was part of this world. Though originally written in Aramaic, it was translated into Greek and used by Jewish and early Christian writers. But as the Roman Empire adopted Christianity in the 4th century, Latin began to take over. And here is where the problem begins. When Jerome translated the Bible into Latin in the late 4th century, creating the Vulgate, he had to make choices. He worked with Hebrew texts for the Old Testament and Greek texts for the New Testament. But he did not include Enoch. He dismissed it as non-canonical. And because of that decision, the Book of Enoch never entered the mainstream Latin tradition. Without a Latin version, the book could not be copied in Western monasteries. And since medieval scribes were the only way texts survived, Enoch vanished from Western shelves. This was not an intentional purge. It was the quiet loss that happens when a book no longer fits the system. Over time, the Greek versions of Enoch were also lost. What remained were fragments, some quotes, some summaries, but not the full book. The only place where the complete text survived was in Ethiopia. There, translated into Ge'ez, the Book of Enoch remained part of the official Bible of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. This survival is one of the great accidents of history. Because while Europe forgot the book, Ethiopia preserved it for over 1,000 years. The story of Enoch is not unique. Many ancient writings were lost simply because they were not translated or copied. Languages act as gates. If a text cannot pass through, it fades. And once a book stops being copied, it is only a matter of time before it disappears. The transition from Greek to Latin was one of the most important shifts in Christian history. It shaped what texts survived, what ideas spread, and what stories were told. Enoch, trapped outside the Latin tradition, was slowly erased from Western memory. Not by fire, not by sword, but by silence. And that silence still echoes in the gaps between what we know and what we were never taught to remember. The disappearance of Enochic texts from the Western Christian tradition did not happen through a single dramatic ban or official decree. It happened slowly, over centuries, through a series of decisions that narrowed the scope of what was considered sacred. At the center of this shift was the rise of the Latin Bible, known as the Vulgate. Translated by Jerome in the late 4th century, the Vulgate became the standard version of the Bible for the Western Church. But Jerome made a key choice. He based his Old Testament not on the Greek Septuagint, which had been widely used by early Christians, but on the Hebrew texts then recognized by Jewish communities. The Book of Enoch, which had not been preserved in Hebrew, was left out. This decision had long-term consequences, because once a text was not included in the official Latin Bible, it had little chance of being copied, read, or taught in Western Christian schools and churches. And in an age before the printing press, copying was survival. If monks and scribes did not reproduce a book by hand, it faded from memory. Over time, the Latin-speaking church began to treat only the books in the Vulgate as legitimate, not because they were always the most ancient or most inspired, but because they were the ones preserved in Latin. This created a feedback loop. What was translated survived. What was not disappeared. Enoch was one of the casualties. Early Christian writers like Tertullian had defended its use. The Epistle of Jude quoted it directly. But by the time Latin Christianity became dominant, the Enochic texts were already falling outside the accepted circle. They were not openly condemned. They were simply ignored. This is important to understand. There was no single moment where church leaders stood up and outlawed the Book of Enoch. Instead, there was a quiet narrowing of Scripture, a process of selecting, translating, and standardizing that slowly pushed certain texts out. This was part of a larger trend in the West. As the Church became more centralized and politically powerful, it sought to unify its teachings. That meant closing off debate, limiting variation, and focusing on texts that supported the emerging doctrines of sin, salvation, and church authority. The apocalyptic tone of Enoch, its emphasis on fallen angels, secret knowledge, and cosmic rebellion, did not fit neatly into that system. So it was left behind. In the East, some of these ideas survived longer, but in the Latin West, they were replaced by a more controlled, institutional theology. What we call the Vulgate Age lasted for over 1,000 years. During that time, the Bible was copied, read, and preached almost entirely in Latin. And because Enoch was never translated into Latin, it stayed on the outside, not burned, not banned, just forgotten. The narrowing of Scripture was not an act of suppression. It was an act of standardization. But the result was the same. A world of voices and visions became a single voice. And Enoch was one of the voices lost in that silence. While Europe slowly erased the Book of Enoch from its religious memory, one Christian tradition held onto it without interruption: the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. This branch of Christianity, isolated from Western influence for much of its history, preserved not just parts of Enoch, but the entire text. In fact, the most complete version of the Book of Enoch that exists today survives because Ethiopian Christians continued to treat it as scripture. They did not see it as fringe or forbidden. They saw it as sacred. And that decision changed the fate of the text forever. Christianity arrived in Ethiopia in the 4th century, around the same time the Roman Empire was adopting the faith. But the Ethiopian Church developed its theology and canon separately. It was not under Roman control. It was not shaped by the councils that eventually defined the Bible in the West. Instead, it followed a unique path, one that included a broader set of scriptures. Among these was the Book of Enoch, translated into the ancient Ge'ez language and read as part of the Church's holy writings. This version of Enoch included sections that had disappeared from the Greek and Aramaic traditions. It offered a full view of the Watchers, the fallen angels, the prophecies, and the vision of cosmic justice that defined the Enochic worldview. What makes the Ethiopian exception so powerful is that it was never a secret. European scholars simply did not pay attention. For centuries, the Book of Enoch was believed to be lost. Only fragments and quotes remained in the writings of early Christians. It was not until the late 18th century that the West rediscovered the full text. In the year 1773, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce travelled to Ethiopia and brought back several Ge'ez manuscripts. Among them was the Book of Enoch. At first, it was treated as a curiosity. Some scholars doubted its authenticity. Others dismissed it as irrelevant. But over time, it became clear that this was the real thing. A full copy of a book once thought lost forever. This rediscovery opened a floodgate. Suddenly, scholars could compare the Ethiopian version with fragments found later among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and what they found confirmed it. The Ethiopian tradition had preserved a genuine ancient text. While Europe forgot, Ethiopia remembered. The Book of Enoch was not a myth, it was a survivor, and its survival proves a larger point. Religious history is not a straight line. It is a network of choices, silences, and exceptions. The Ethiopian church made a choice to preserve a voice that others had silenced, and that choice gave modern readers access to a vision of angels, judgment, and hidden knowledge that the West had buried. The Ethiopian exception is not just a footnote. It is the strongest thread linking us back to the original Enochic world. It shows that what is lost in one place may live on in another. And it reminds us that sometimes the most important truths survive not through power, but through quiet faith and cultural memory. The Vatican Library is often imagined as a hidden vault full of forbidden knowledge, a secret place where lost books and ancient scrolls are locked away from the public. But the truth is more complex. The Vatican Library is real. It has existed for hundreds of years, and while it does hold a vast collection of manuscripts, its role has been less about dramatic secrecy and more about quiet control, not through fire or destruction, but through policies, access rules, and careful curation. It is a gatekeeper. And for centuries, it shaped what could be studied, copied, and believed. Founded formally in the year 1451 by Pope Nicholas V, the Vatican Library was meant to be a center of knowledge for the Church. It collected thousands of texts from across the Christian world: Greek manuscripts, Latin Bibles, early church writings, and rare copies of ancient books all found their way into its walls. Over time, the library grew into one of the most important collections in Europe. But access was limited. Only approved scholars, often priests or those working under church authority, could see what was inside. The general public, and even many intellectuals, were left outside the gate. This is where the logic of control begins. By keeping knowledge inside a central location and controlling who could view it, the Church created a system of silent power. It did not need to burn every book it disagreed with. It only needed to remove it from public reach. Books that did not support official doctrine weren't always destroyed. They were shelved, unread, untranslated. And because most people could not read Latin or Greek and had no access to the manuscripts, those texts faded from memory. Over generations, this became a form of soft censorship, not through violence, but through silence. The Book of Enoch is a good example of how this system worked. While there is no solid proof that the Vatican Library held a full copy of Enoch before the Ethiopian manuscripts arrived in Europe, it is clear that texts related to Enoch were known in early church history. Quotes from Enoch appear in Christian writings. Fragments survive in other documents. But the complete text was not preserved in Latin. And because the Latin tradition dominated the Vatican, anything outside it was treated as secondary or suspect. Even today, the Vatican Library holds priceless manuscripts that are difficult to access. In recent years, more of the collection has been digitized. Scholars from around the world can now view materials that were once hidden. But the history of the library still shows how knowledge can be shaped by the way it is stored, labeled, and released. Control does not always look like chains. Sometimes it looks like a locked room and a long waiting list. The Vatican Library is not a myth. It is a real place with a long record of collecting and curating the written word, and that makes it one of the most powerful filters of religious memory in the Western world. There are many rumors about the Vatican Library, stories about lost books, forbidden prophecies, and hidden texts locked away in underground vaults. Some people imagine ancient scrolls about the watchers sitting on dusty shelves, sealed from the public forever. But what the Vatican actually holds is far more documented and far less mysterious than most theories suggest. The truth is this: The Vatican Library contains one of the world's largest collections of biblical, patristic, and classical manuscripts. And while that does make it a powerful gatekeeper of religious history, there is no solid evidence that secret prophecies of the Watchers are being hidden there. The library officially began in the 15th century, but many of the manuscripts it holds are much older. It includes over 80,000 manuscripts and over 1 million printed books. The focus of its collection has always been the preservation of Christian tradition, especially the writings of church fathers, early biblical texts, and documents related to church law. It holds important versions of the Latin Vulgate, Greek biblical manuscripts, and early Christian commentaries. These materials are incredibly valuable for scholars. They help trace how the Bible developed, how theology was debated, and how doctrine changed over time. What it does not contain, based on current catalogues and scholarly records, is a full version of the Book of Enoch in Latin or Greek. Nor does it contain a secret file of lost Watcher prophecies. These claims, though exciting, are not backed by the evidence. The idea that the Vatican is hiding specific texts about the Watchers usually comes from modern books, conspiracy theories, or internet speculation, not from actual archival research. That does not mean the Church has never suppressed dangerous ideas. But when it comes to Enochic literature, the story is more about slow disappearance than active erasure. Fragments of Enoch do exist in other libraries. Pieces were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls in the mid-20th century. Some parts survived in quotes by early Christian writers. But the complete version came from Ethiopia, not from the Vatican. This is an important point. If the Vatican had a full copy, scholars would have noted it by now. The library's contents have been studied for centuries. While access is controlled, thousands of scholars have gone through its archives, and many of its manuscripts have been published, digitized, or listed in public catalogues. The gaps in Enochic literature are more likely due to translation choices, copying habits, and canon debates than some secret hiding place. This does not mean the Vatican Library is neutral. Like any institution, it reflects the values and priorities of those who built and managed it. It chose to preserve certain texts and let others fade. But that is different from intentionally locking away prophecies. Most of what the Vatican holds is known. And most of what it does not hold, like the full Book of Enoch, was never there to begin with. The story is not about buried secrets. It is about how knowledge survives, how it spreads, and what choices determine what gets remembered. During the Middle Ages, the story of the Watchers seemed to vanish from mainstream Christian teaching. The Book of Enoch was gone from church readings, forgotten in seminaries, and erased from most official teachings. But the themes of the Watchers did not disappear. They were rebranded. Their presence slipped into medieval thought through angel lore, demonology, and the growing fascination with spiritual hierarchies. Without ever naming Enoch, medieval writers echoed his warnings about fallen angels, forbidden knowledge, and celestial rebellion. The Watchers lived on in disguise. One of the clearest signs of this quiet survival is in the structure of angelology that took shape in the early and high Middle Ages. Thinkers like Pseudo-Dionysius in the 6th century and later Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century divided angels into ranks and orders. These hierarchies included groups like thrones, dominions, powers, and principalities. The idea was to map out the spiritual world as an ordered system, reflecting the divine structure of heaven. But embedded in these lists were old concerns about angels who stepped out of line. In fact, many medieval texts discuss how some angels rebelled, took on human roles, or shared forbidden knowledge. These stories sound a lot like the Watchers, even when they are not called by that name. Demonology also carried traces of the Watchers. As beliefs about demons developed, the idea that some spirits had once been angels became common. Medieval manuals on exorcism, spiritual warfare, and temptation often spoke of demons as former servants of heaven who had fallen because of pride, lust, or disobedience. This mirrors the story of the Watchers in Enoch, who fell after desiring human women and sharing divine secrets. The link becomes clearer in texts like the Livre des Esprits and other early grimoires, which describe demons by name, rank, and origin. While these sources do not quote Enoch directly, the structure they use suggests they inherited fragments of his world. Even art and folklore reflect this shadow influence. Paintings of giants battling angels, carvings of chained spirits beneath the earth, and tales of strange beings who once lived before the flood all carry echoes of the old Watcher myth. In some cases, the giants of Genesis became the ogres and monstrous races of medieval legend. The idea that there was a prehistoric world full of hybrid beings, punished by God, never fully left the cultural memory. It simply shifted forms. By the late Middle Ages, as mysticism and apocalyptic speculation grew, some writers began to ask deeper questions about the origins of evil and spiritual corruption. They drew from scripture, tradition, and the mysterious gaps left by the canon. Though they did not openly teach the Book of Enoch, they carried forward its themes. The Watchers were no longer spoken of directly, but their story survived in disguise, shaping how Western Christianity understood angels, demons, and the dangerous border between heaven and earth. It was not a rejection of Enoch. It was a retelling under new names, hidden in plain sight. In the early modern period, Europe entered what many now call the Age of Forbidden Books. This was not just about burning heretical texts or chasing secret cults. It was about creating a system, one where the Catholic Church and later some Protestant groups tried to define the boundaries of knowledge by controlling what could be read, printed, or taught. At the heart of this system was the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Prohibited Books. First published in the year 1559 under Pope Paul IV, the index listed works considered dangerous to faith or morals. These were books by heretics, critics of the Church, or authors who promoted science, magic, or theology outside accepted doctrine. The Book of Enoch is not explicitly named on the earliest versions of the index. This is important. It means that while Enochic texts were outside the canon, they were not always directly targeted in this formal system. But the ideas found in Enoch, especially those about fallen angels, secret knowledge, and divine judgment, did overlap with themes that were increasingly labeled suspicious. Books dealing with angels, cosmology, prophecy, or pre-Christian wisdom were often placed under scrutiny. So while Enoch was not singled out, the atmosphere was not friendly to its return. Apocryphal texts in general were treated as spiritually risky. Some were preserved in academic circles, others were used by fringe groups, but they were rarely encouraged for public reading. During the Counter-Reformation, this control deepened. The Church wanted to protect believers from confusion and doubt. That meant narrowing the sources of spiritual knowledge. Only approved Bibles, saints' lives, and theological works passed through the filter. Anything outside that filter could be banned, edited, or buried. This affected not just ancient apocrypha, but also new writings. Galileo's scientific texts were banned. Mystical writers had their works censored. Even approved saints were sometimes silenced if their visions strayed too far from doctrine. In this context, a full text like the Book of Enoch, filled with otherworldly beings and divine secrets, had little chance of official recognition. The printing press made things both better and worse. It allowed forbidden texts to spread faster. But it also gave authorities a reason to crack down harder. Printers could be fined, arrested, or even executed for producing banned material. This pressure pushed many alternative books underground. Private libraries, secret translations, and handwritten copies kept some of these works alive. But the cost of spreading unapproved ideas was real. The story of Enoch during this age is one of absence, not public conflict, but public silence. It wasn't burned in squares. It was simply not there. Later, scholars and explorers would rediscover Enoch through Ethiopia and archaeology. But in the age of forbidden books, it stood outside the wall of allowed ideas. The system did not need to attack it. The system just ignored it. And in doing so, it kept entire generations from reading one of the most mysterious and provocative texts in the ancient world. For centuries, the Book of Enoch was considered lost in the West. Scholars knew it had once existed. They found quotes in early Christian writings and saw its influence in the Epistle of Jude. But no full copy was known in Europe. It was treated like a ghost text, part of the distant past, gone without a trace. That began to change in the 18th century when European explorers started reaching Ethiopia. What they found there shocked them. The Book of Enoch had not vanished. It had been preserved all along as part of the official canon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The most famous moment in this rediscovery came in the year 1773. A Scottish explorer named James Bruce travelled to Ethiopia. He was not looking for ancient texts. His journey was part of a larger mission to map the source of the Nile and report on African kingdoms. But during his time there, Bruce obtained several manuscripts written in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of the Ethiopian Church. Among them was the complete Book of Enoch. When he returned to Europe with the text, many dismissed it. Some scholars thought it was fake. Others believed it was too late in origin to matter. But slowly, interest began to grow. By the early 19th century, translations of the Ethiopian Book of Enoch began to appear in Europe. Richard Lawrence, an Oxford scholar, published an English version in the year 1821. This was the first time in over 1,000 years that Western readers could engage with the full text. What they found was stunning. The book included detailed stories of the Watchers, their fall, the birth of the giants, visions of heaven, prophecies of judgment, and symbolic timelines that stretched from the beginning of creation to the end of the world. It became clear that Enoch had never been lost. It had simply been ignored by the Western tradition. The rediscovery set off a wave of new scholarship. Researchers began to compare the Ethiopian version with fragments found elsewhere. In the mid-20th century, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls added even more weight. Among the scrolls found at Qumran were Aramaic fragments of the Book of Enoch, proving that the text had ancient Jewish origins. This silenced many of the early critics who had doubted its authenticity. It showed that the Ethiopian Church had preserved a genuine ancient work, one that had been part of the Second Temple Jewish world and influential among early Christians. The scholar's hunt for Enoch is not just a story of recovery. It is a reminder of how knowledge can be hidden by geography, language, and religious politics. While Europe built cathedrals and canon lists, Ethiopia kept reading a book that others forgot. That difference in preservation changed what generations believed was possible. The rediscovery of Enoch rewrote part of biblical history, and it proved that sometimes the past is not lost. It is just waiting in another language, in another land, for someone to ask the right question. In the year 1947, a discovery in the Judean desert changed everything. In a series of caves near the site of Qumran, a young Bedouin shepherd stumbled upon ancient scrolls hidden in clay jars. What followed was one of the greatest archaeological shocks of the modern era. These scrolls, later called the Dead Sea Scrolls, included biblical texts, commentaries, and apocalyptic writings dating back to the Second Temple period. But among the fragments, scholars found something that forced a complete rewrite of assumptions about early Judaism. They found multiple copies and pieces of the Book of Enoch. This was the proof that many had doubted for years. Enoch was not just a Christian curiosity or a late Ethiopian myth. It was an ancient Jewish text, written before the time of Jesus and widely read by Jewish communities in the centuries leading up to the 1st century. The scrolls included portions of several Enochic books, especially the Book of the Watchers. Written in Aramaic, the language many Jews spoke during that time, the fragments matched the content, preserved in the Ethiopian version. This discovery confirmed that Enoch was not a medieval forgery or a regional invention. It had roots deep in Jewish apocalyptic tradition, and it had been part of the sacred imagination during one of the most important periods in religious history. The fact that the Qumran community, often linked to the Essenes, preserved these texts alongside early versions of Isaiah and the Psalms revealed just how central Enochic ideas had been. Concepts like fallen angels, final judgment, heavenly visions, and cosmic timelines were not fringe beliefs. They were part of the mainstream spiritual thinking of the time. Before this discovery, many scholars had assumed that apocalyptic themes in Christianity came later, shaped by Greek influence or invented by early Christians. The Dead Sea Scrolls shattered that theory. They showed that Jewish thinkers, before and during the life of Jesus, were already writing about cosmic battles, angelic hierarchies, and the punishment of corrupt powers. Enoch was not a side note. It was a blueprint for how many saw the world, time, and divine justice. The scrolls also raised questions about how the canon was formed. If Enoch was so important to these communities, why was it excluded from most Jewish and Christian Bibles? The answer lies in what happened after the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70. Judaism and Christianity both began to narrow their texts to create unity and stability. Enoch, with its wild visions and controversial themes, did not make the final cut. But Qumran showed that it had been there, shaping minds and hearts before the line was drawn. The Dead Sea Scrolls were a shock, not because they introduced something new, but because they confirmed something ancient. They proved that the Enochic worldview had been real, alive, and widely accepted before history tried to erase it. For scholars, it was like finding a missing chapter in the story of religion. And for the rest of the world, it was a sign that what was once dismissed as legend may have been closer to the roots of faith than anyone imagined. When people hear that parts of the Book of Enoch were lost, they often imagine a single ancient scroll with a complete prophecy hidden away in a vault or destroyed by censors. But that picture does not match how ancient texts actually worked. What we call Enoch is not one book. It is a collection of writings, assembled over time, translated across languages, and passed through many hands. Some parts survived fully, others exist only in fragments, and some were likely never finished to begin with. The idea of a lost complete prophecy is more myth than fact. What really happened was a chain of gaps, variations, and forgotten paths of transmission. The Book of Enoch as we know it contains several sections. The Book of the Watchers, the Book of Parables, the Astronomical Book, the Dream Visions, and the Epistle of Enoch. These were written by different authors in different times and for different audiences. Scholars believe the earliest parts may go back to the 3rd century before Christ. Other sections may have been added as late as the 1st century. This layered nature makes it difficult to define what the original or complete Enoch was supposed to be. There may never have been a single finalized version. When we say a text is lost, that can mean several things. Sometimes we have evidence that a section once existed, but no longer does. That is the case with some references in ancient writings that mention Enoch material we no longer possess. Other times, parts of the text survive in one tradition, but not in another. The Ethiopian Ge'ez version of Enoch is the most complete, but even it shows signs of editing and damage. There are places where the narrative jumps, where lines repeat, or where meaning seems broken. These are clues that something was either lost in copying, or that the original material was already unclear. Then there are the fragmentary texts. The Dead Sea Scrolls gave us pieces of Enoch in Aramaic. These fragments do not match the Ethiopian version word for word. They show slight differences in wording, structure, and even content. This is normal for ancient texts. Copying was done by hand, mistakes happened, editors made choices, and over centuries, different communities kept different versions. None of these versions can claim to be the one true original. Each is a window into how people in different times saw the text and used it. Missing transmission chains are perhaps the biggest reason for the gaps. In the West, the Book of Enoch was not copied into Latin. Without translation, it had no future in Europe. But in Ethiopia, where it was translated and preserved, it continued as living scripture. That one decision created two very different histories for the same book. When people speak of lost prophecies, what they often mean is the absence of access. The text was not hidden. It just stopped being passed on. So when we talk about Enoch, it is not about a vanished prophecy waiting in a cave. It is about fragile chains, broken paths, and the long journey of words trying to survive time. Many people confuse the Vatican Library with the Vatican Archives. In movies and conspiracy theories, these two places are often blended together into one secret vault, where forbidden books and lost prophecies are locked away. But in reality, they are separate institutions with different purposes. Understanding the difference is key to keeping the story grounded in facts while still exploring the layers of mystery that surround the Vatican's role in preserving history. The Vatican Library, officially called the Vatican Apostolic Library, is one of the oldest and most respected manuscript collections in the world. It was formally established in the 15th century under Pope Nicholas V. Its mission was to collect and preserve texts that reflected the intellectual and spiritual heritage of the Church. It houses more than 80,000 manuscripts and over 1 million printed books. This includes ancient Bibles, early church writings, classical philosophy, and rare scientific texts. Scholars from around the world study its materials to better understand history, theology, and literature. Access to the Vatican Library is restricted, but not secret. Qualified researchers can apply to visit and study specific texts. Many of the most important manuscripts have been digitized or published in academic editions. This means that while the library is carefully controlled, it is not hidden. It is a real academic institution, open in its purpose, though selective in its access. The Vatican archives, on the other hand, are a different world. Formerly called the secret archives, the name comes from the Latin word secretum, meaning private. These archives are not secret in the modern sense of being hidden from the public, but they are the personal records of the Pope and the central administration of the Church. They include papal letters, church council documents, trial records, and diplomatic correspondence going back over 1,000 years. The archives were formally separated from the library in the 17th century by Pope Paul V. Since then, they have operated as a private repository of internal church records. Access is granted only to approved scholars and usually requires a clear academic purpose. Even then, some documents are off-limits, especially those related to recent papacies. This structure creates a natural space for mystery, not because the archives are filled with supernatural secrets, but because their contents are difficult to verify. The unknown creates curiosity. And in the case of ancient texts like the Book of Enoch, people often wonder if suppressed copies might be sitting in a back room, uncatalogued and unread. As of now, there is no confirmed evidence that the complete Book of Enoch exists in the Vatican archives. If it does, it has not been acknowledged by scholars or church officials. Most likely, the Vatican simply never preserved a full copy because it was never part of the Latin biblical tradition. Still, the line between the library and the archives remains blurry for the public. That confusion fuels speculation. It keeps the door open for what might be possible. And in that space between fact and imagination, the mystery of lost knowledge continues to grow. The Watchers are often seen as supernatural beings who crossed a line between heaven and earth, but their story has also worked for thousands of years as a symbol. In many cases, the imagery of the Watchers becomes a coded way to talk about corruption in high places. The idea of powerful figures who fall from grace, who misuse secret knowledge, and who set off disasters by breaking divine boundaries can mirror real human institutions. From ancient empires to modern governments, the Watchers narrative gives people a way to speak about injustice, betrayal, and hidden agendas without directly naming the rulers in question. In the Book of Enoch, the Watchers are angels who descend to earth and give humans forbidden knowledge. This knowledge includes things like sorcery, warfare, and cosmetics. While that may seem like a strange mix, each one reflects a deeper fear. The fear that someone behind the scenes is controlling society by shaping how we think, fight, or even see ourselves. By blaming the Watchers, the text points to a problem that is both spiritual and political. It shows that evil does not just come from outside, but from those who were supposed to protect us. In Second Temple Judaism, where the Book of Enoch likely took shape, Jewish communities were living under foreign rule. First the Babylonians, then the Persians, then the Greeks, and finally the Romans. These empires imposed taxes, laws, and religious changes. but open criticism could be dangerous. By using the story of fallen angels, authors could talk about divine rebellion as a mirror of earthly tyranny. The Watchers became a way to say that something was wrong with the world, that justice had been broken, and that judgment was coming for those in power. This pattern continued in early Christianity. Apocalyptic texts, including parts of Enoch, helped believers express frustration with Roman control. When the book of Revelation talks about the fall of Babylon, it is really about Rome. And when Enoch talks about imprisoned angels waiting for judgment, it can be read as a warning to human leaders who act like gods. The Watchers became a symbol of rulers who fall, of empires that collapse, and of systems that cannot last forever. Even in the Middle Ages and later, Watcher themes appeared when people questioned authority. Writers used angel and demon language to talk about corruption in the church, false prophets, or hidden agendas within royal courts. The message stayed the same. Power without wisdom leads to ruin. Knowledge without responsibility leads to chaos. The Watchers were not just ancient figures. They were a warning sign. This political use of the Watchers helps explain why the story never fully disappears. It comes back during times of fear, crisis, or social change. People reach for the image of powerful beings who broke the rules and caused a fall. Whether in ancient texts or modern fiction, the Watchers still speak to a deep truth, that those who rise highest can fall hardest, and that hidden knowledge, once unleashed, cannot be easily controlled. One of the most surprising parts of the Book of Enoch is not just its stories about angels and judgment, but its detailed focus on time. The section known as the Astronomical Book is one of the earliest known efforts to map the movement of the sun, moon, stars, and seasons in a way that connects science with theology. It describes a solar calendar of 364 days, split evenly across the year. This was not just a technical detail, it was a major statement. Because in the ancient world, how you measured time was directly tied to your view of the universe, your rituals, and your authority. Timekeeping was not just science, it was a battlefield for power. In Second Temple Judaism, different groups followed different calendars. The Book of Enoch represents a priestly tradition that believed the solar calendar was the original and correct way to mark sacred time. This calendar was simple, predictable, and reflected the order of heaven. According to Enoch, it was given by angelic beings and aligned with divine law. In contrast, the lunar calendar, which had 12 months based on the cycles of the moon, required adding leap months to stay in sync with the seasons. This created confusion and disputes. The Essenes, the group often linked with the Dead Sea Scrolls, followed a calendar similar to the one in Enoch. They believed that mainstream temple authorities in Jerusalem had corrupted the calendar and were celebrating feasts on the wrong days. For them, following the wrong calendar meant breaking the covenant with God. This conflict shows why Enoch's timekeeping material was more than just observation. It was a theological weapon. By claiming that the calendar was revealed by angels, Enochic writers gave divine weight to their version of sacred time. It allowed them to say that those who disagreed were not just wrong, but were opposing heaven itself. This made calendar debates intensely political. They affected how communities fasted, when they celebrated holy days, and who had the right to lead worship. The theme of time as a form of control continued in Christian and Islamic history. In the 4th century, the Council of Nicaea set a standardized date for Easter. Later, The switch from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar in the year 1582 caused waves across Europe. Some nations adopted the new system immediately. Others resisted. The decision of how to count days became tied to national identity, religious loyalty, and trust in authority. People who questioned the calendar questioned the system itself. Enoch's focus on the heavens reflects a world where astronomy, theology, and politics were deeply connected. The idea that angels taught humans how to read the sky shows how ancient people saw time as sacred, not just hours and minutes, but cosmic rhythms that revealed hidden truths. The calendar was not just a tool, it was a mirror of divine order. And in the story of Enoch, keeping time became a form of prophecy, a way to align earth with heaven, and a sign of who truly understood the language of the stars. During the Renaissance, Europe went through a deep shift in how it thought about knowledge. This was not just about art or architecture. It was about going back to the roots of history, language, and belief. Humanism, the intellectual movement at the heart of the Renaissance, encouraged scholars to return to the sources. That meant reading original texts in Greek, Hebrew, and Latin, instead of relying only on church-approved summaries or commentaries. As printing presses spread and ancient manuscripts were rediscovered in monasteries and libraries, the West reopened doors it had long left closed. Among the texts that drew new interest were those that had been neglected, ignored, or quietly discouraged for centuries. This included books like Enoch. Although the Book of Enoch itself was not yet fully reintroduced in this period, the climate was changing in ways that made its eventual rediscovery possible. Scholars like Erasmus of Rotterdam in the early 16th century pushed for new translations of the Bible that returned to Greek sources instead of relying only on the Latin Vulgate. Others, like Pico della Mirandola, studied Hebrew, Kabbalah, and ancient mystical texts in search of wisdom that predated or stood outside the Church's tight framework. These thinkers believed that truth was larger than any one tradition, and that ancient knowledge could still unlock mysteries about the world and the soul. That meant old books, even the strange or dangerous ones, deserved to be read. Manuscript hunters travelled across Europe and beyond, collecting forgotten works. Some of them found texts that had been kept in Eastern Christian communities or buried in private collections. As Greek-speaking scholars fled the fall of Constantinople in the year 1453, they brought rare books with them into Western Europe. This wave of migration helped revive interest in early Christian writings, Jewish apocrypha, and even Egyptian and Chaldean texts that had long been considered off-limits or irrelevant. What had once been labelled heretical now seemed fascinating. What had been ignored was suddenly valuable. The institutions of power weren't always happy with this change. The Catholic Church, still struggling with internal reform and rising criticism, tried to maintain control. The Council of Trent, which began in the year 1545, reaffirmed the canon of Scripture and warned against unapproved readings. But the energy of the Renaissance could not be fully stopped. The more people read, the more they questioned. And the more they questioned, the more they sought out texts that had been left outside the official story. The Renaissance was not the moment when Enoch returned fully. That would come later, through Ethiopia and archaeology. But it was the moment when the ground shifted, when ancient texts were no longer feared, but desired, when curiosity began to win over censorship, and when the idea of going back to the beginning was no longer dangerous, but necessary. In that spirit, the seeds of Enoch's revival were planted. Hidden texts waited. And for the first time in centuries, the West was ready to look again. The idea that the Vatican is hiding secret books of prophecy from the Book of Enoch has become a common claim in modern internet culture. Videos, articles, and forums often say that deep within the Vatican archives lies a hidden collection of texts revealing the full truth about the Watchers, fallen angels, and forbidden knowledge. These claims usually suggest that the Church fears what would happen if people knew what these prophecies really said. But when we look at the facts, a different story appears. There is a long history of tension between institutional religion and apocalyptic texts, and it is true that Enoch was excluded from most Western canons. But there is no verified evidence that a complete and sensational Enochic prophecy is being hidden on purpose today. The Vatican Library, which holds thousands of ancient manuscripts, is a scholarly institution. Its collections include early Christian writings, Hebrew texts, and classical works. Many of its holdings have been catalogued and are available for academic research. The Vatican archives, which store administrative and diplomatic records, are more restricted. But even here, scholars with proper credentials have studied key documents going back centuries. If a powerful lost version of Enoch filled with secret Watcher prophecies were discovered, it would be a global event in biblical studies. No such text has been documented or leaked by any credible source. What we do know is that the Book of Enoch was preserved in full, not by Rome, but by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. That version, written in the Ge'ez language, has been available to scholars since the 18th century. It includes visions, warnings, and cosmic timelines. But these are not the same as the modern myths suggest. They are symbolic and theological, not predictive roadmaps of future events. The Dead Sea Scrolls added to the picture by confirming the ancient Jewish roots of the Enoch tradition. But again, nothing in those findings supports the idea that there is a hidden version with explosive end-time secrets locked away by church officials. The myth that the Vatican is hiding something grows partly from how real control of knowledge worked in history. There were times when texts were banned, books were censored, and access was restricted. The Index of Forbidden Books, created in the year 1559, shows that religious institutions once had strong views about what people should or should not read. But this historical fact is not the same as modern conspiracy. The line between caution and control, or between forgotten and forbidden, is complex. It is easy to imagine that a mysterious power is hiding something. It is harder to accept that history often forgets things for less dramatic reasons. The truth is that much of what circulates about hidden Enoch texts today is a mix of misunderstanding, speculation, and storytelling. That doesn't mean the subject is unimportant, but it does mean we have to separate what is documented from what is imagined. The real Enoch is strange and powerful enough on its own. It doesn't need secret vaults to be worth reading. And sometimes the real mystery is not what is hidden, but what we haven't yet chosen to understand. Today, when we look at the Book of Enoch, we can separate what is factual from speculation. First, we can prove that Enoch survived, not as a lost myth, but as a real text preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The complete Ge'ez version has existed for centuries and has been available to European scholars since the 18th century. This version contains all the traditional sections, including the Book of the Watchers, the astronomical book, and the dream visions. We can verify its existence, study its language, and compare it to references in other ancient writings. Second, there are partial ancient witnesses. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the Judean desert in the year 1947, include Aramaic fragments of the Book of Enoch. These confirm that portions of the text existed in Jewish communities during the Second Temple period. Other references appear in early Christian writings, like the Epistle of Jude, which quotes Enoch directly. These citations show that Enoch was known and influential long before it appeared in Ethiopia, and long before any modern myths about hidden prophecies. Third, we can prove the context of manuscript culture. Texts were copied by hand in monasteries, libraries, and private collections. The Vatican Library, founded in the 15th century, holds thousands of manuscripts that reflect the Church's effort to preserve intellectual and religious history. Similarly, other libraries across Europe and the Middle East maintained collections of apocryphal and canonical works. The survival or loss of a text often depended on which communities prioritized its copying. That means the absence of Enoch in Latin Europe does not indicate intentional suppression in a conspiratorial sense, but rather the result of historical choices and translation practices. Fourth, archival certainty has real limits. The Vatican archives contain administrative records and church correspondence, not secret prophetic manuscripts. Scholars with approved access can study documents from the 8th century onward, but there is no evidence of hidden, complete copies of Enoch. What the archives do prove is the pattern of preservation, cataloguing, and selective access that shaped knowledge over centuries. This helps explain why Enoch was sidelined in the West while surviving in Ethiopia. Finally, what we can prove is also a lesson in perspective. Enoch's survival is remarkable. Its influence can be traced in ancient Jewish thought, early Christian literature, and even in medieval angelology. We can study fragments, translations, and references to reconstruct parts of its historical significance. What we cannot prove are sensational claims of secret prophetic knowledge locked in Vatican vaults. That remains speculation. The documented story is already extraordinary. It shows how texts travel, how knowledge is preserved across cultures, and how historical forces shape what generations will read. Enoch's journey reminds us that history is often a puzzle of survival, fragments, and human decisions. The strongest facts are the text itself, its citations in ancient sources, the catalogued manuscripts, and the careful, though incomplete, record of its transmission. Everything beyond that belongs to curiosity, interpretation, or myth. The Book of Enoch is not just a record of fallen angels and cosmic visions. It carries a warning that has echoed through history and remains relevant today. The text emphasizes that knowledge alone is not neutral. When beings, whether angels or humans, acquire information or skills without responsibility, chaos can follow. The Watchers gained knowledge of metals, sorcery, astrology, and other arts. Instead of using it to serve a higher purpose, they acted on desire, pride, and curiosity unchecked. This led to corruption, violence, and the birth of giants, demonstrating that knowledge without conscience can destabilize societies and even challenge divine order. The text frames this as a universal principle, applicable not only to supernatural beings, but also to human empires. Leaders who wield power without moral guidance risk the same fall. Enoch presents this lesson as both descriptive and prescriptive. the Watcher's punishment is carefully detailed, showing a system of accountability. They are bound until judgment, unable to act freely. The narrative conveys that oversight and ethical responsibility are essential wherever knowledge is used. This principle can be traced historically in how religious and political institutions tried to control information. In the Second Temple period, writings like Enoch and other apocalyptic texts served to remind communities that misuse of power, whether through tyranny, secret knowledge, or rebellion against divine law, would have consequences. It is a moral framework that links cosmic events with social order, implying that the same rules govern both realms. The pattern repeats in later centuries. As European powers expanded, religious authorities often insisted on regulating who could read, copy, or interpret sacred texts. The Index of Forbidden Books in the year 1559 and the careful curation of manuscripts in the Vatican Library illustrate how institutions recognized that knowledge could empower or corrupt. The story of the Watchers functions as a metaphor for this tension. It warns that what humans and angels are allowed to know must be matched by the capacity to use it responsibly. Ignoring this principle can lead to moral and societal collapse. Even in modern scholarship, the lesson resonates. The rediscovery of Enoch in Ethiopia, the fragments found at Qumran, and the study of apocryphal traditions highlight that knowledge itself is fragile. It survives only when treated with care. Misinterpretation or misuse can distort its meaning and impact. The Watcher's example shows that knowledge divorced from ethics is dangerous. It is not the content alone that matters, but the context and conscience of the one who holds it. Ultimately, the last question the Watchers leave behind is timeless. What happens when those with insight choose ambition over accountability? How can communities ensure that knowledge benefits rather than destroys? History shows repeated answers. Regulation, teaching, ethical oversight, and moral reflection are crucial. The Book of Enoch, through its visions of angels, judgment, and human consequences, reminds readers that the most dangerous prophecy is not a prediction of events, but a principle. Knowledge without conscience can corrupt angels, empires, and individuals alike. It is a warning that continues to challenge humanity, to balance curiosity with a responsibility, power with ethics, and learning with wisdom.